The night in Boston was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed to swallow any sound, making the world feel distant and detached. Matthew Grant, a successful businessman, stepped out of his black Cadillac, his thoughts focused on the deal awaiting him at the nearby cafe. His eyes scanned the street, catching glimpses of tired commuters hurrying home, their faces lost in the monotony of daily life. The glow of street lamps cast a soft yellow hue on the city, and the low hum of traffic seemed distant, almost irrelevant. But then, a sound cut through the silence. A cry. It wasn't the usual noise of the city, a car horn or someone talking on the phone. It was sharp, raw, filled with so much desperation that it pierced the calm like a dagger. At first, Matthew tried to ignore it. There were always cries, especially in a city like Boston. But something about this one made his feet slow. His eyes shifted, seeking the source. And then he saw him. A boy, no older than 6, standing by a rusted dumpster. The boy's clothes were ragged, and his face was streaked with tears, his tiny hands clutching a worn-out teddy bear. He was alone. The child's voice cracked as he pleaded for help, his words barely audible but impossible to ignore. "My mom's trapped inside," the boy gasped, pointing toward the dumpster. "Please, you have to help her." Matthew's first instinct was to dismiss him. It wasn't uncommon for children to be left alone or to make up stories. The world was full of them, and he had no time for this one. But there was something in the boy's eyes, something that made Matthew hesitate. They weren't the wide, innocent eyes of a child who had just lost his way. No, these were eyes filled with something deeper, a desperation that was beyond any child's understanding, a fear that made Matthew's chest tighten. The crowd around them took notice, but only briefly. A few people slowed down, curiosity flickering in their eyes, but then continued on their way, shaking their heads in dismissal. An old man muttered under his breath that the boy was imagining things, while a woman whispered to her husband that the child's mother had probably abandoned him. No one did anything. No one even stopped. Matthew stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at the boy, whose trembling hand still pointed toward the dumpster. It was as if the world had faded around them, leaving only the boy's desperate plea hanging in the air. The longer Matthew stood there, the more the weight of the situation settled on him. He could have walked away, could have dismissed it just like everyone else. He was a man used to control, used to logic, used to pushing away anything that didn't fit into his neat, organized life. But in that moment, something shifted. A feeling he couldn't ignore began to build inside him. It wasn't a logical thought, nor was it the usual business decision he was accustomed to making. It was something raw, something human. The boy's cry had reached something deep inside him, something he had long buried. For the first time in a long time, Matthew didn't think about deals or power. He thought about what it would feel like to be that child, desperate and alone, surrounded by a world that just walked past. What was it that made him stop? Was it the boy's voice, or was it the memory of his own past, one that he had long since tried to forget? Matthew didn't know, but one thing was certain. Something about this child, standing alone in the dark, had awakened a part of him that he thought had been lost forever. Without fully understanding why, he turned back toward the boy. The evening in Boston was heavy with a quiet stillness. The city seemed to slow down as people moved like shadows, hurrying to their destinations, their faces weary from the grind of everyday life. Matthew Grant, the millionaire businessman with a reputation for being cold and detached, stepped out of his sleek black Cadillac. His thoughts were consumed by an important meeting waiting for him, the latest in a long string of deals that could expand his empire. He didn't pay attention to the world around him as he often did. The noise, the hustle, the people, they were all background to his focused, goal-driven life. But then, something broke through the monotony. A sharp cry cut through the evening air. At first, It was just a distant sound, something Matthew almost ignored. But as it grew louder, more desperate, his steps faltered. He turned his head, and his eyes landed on a small figure near a rusted dumpster. A boy, no older than 6, stood there, his clothes ragged, his face streaked with tears, and in his tiny hands, he clutched a tattered teddy bear. The boy's cries were raw, his voice strained and hoarse, as though he had been crying for hours. "My mom is inside," the boy pleaded. "Please, you have to save her." For a moment, Matthew thought it was just another child lost in the city, another child whose story would go unnoticed. But there was something about the boy's eyes. They weren't the wide, innocent eyes of a child seeking attention. They were filled with something deeper: desperation, fear, a kind of pleading that Matthew couldn't ignore. The crowd around them paid no mind. A few people glanced over but quickly moved on, their faces indifferent. They laughed, shook their heads, and dismissed the boy's cry as nothing more than a child's fantasy. But Matthew couldn't look away. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his mind wrestling with the urge to continue on with his life as usual. But something held him there, rooted in place, as he studied the boy's face. It was as if, in that fleeting moment, the world had stopped, and only the boy and his desperate plea remained. Matthew, a man used to controlling everything around him, felt a tightness in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. The boy's words hung in the air, cutting through the night like a sharp blade. "Please, you have to help me," the boy begged. And Matthew Grant, a man who had built his life on wealth and power, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, an unsettling weight that pressed down on his heart. At first, Matthew tried to push the boy out of his mind. He had a meeting to attend, an important one that could expand his empire, and time was always running out. The boy's cries were just another distraction, something that would soon fade away. But as he turned away, Matthew couldn't shake the sound. It echoed in his mind, becoming louder, more insistent, impossible to ignore. The city seemed to blur around him, the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of evening breeze fading into the background. All he could hear was that desperate plea. Against his better judgment, Matthew's feet slowed, and his eyes turned back toward the boy. The small figure stood there, helpless, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt and tears, his tiny body trembling. There was no denying it now. This wasn't a fleeting moment. The boy's eyes weren't wide with childish wonder or curiosity, but with the raw, unfiltered desperation of someone who had seen too much pain. His eyes spoke of a suffering far beyond his years, a pain that reached deep into Matthew's chest and gripped him with a force he couldn't explain. Matthew's first instinct was to push past it. The world had no room for softness. He was a man who thrived on logic, who made decisions based on numbers, facts, and cold truths. "Go find your family, kid," he muttered under his breath, trying to dismiss the boy and move on with his life. He brushed the boy's small, trembling hands off his sleeve as if to physically push the entire situation away. But as he turned, something inside him hesitated. The boy's cries followed him, echoing in his ears with growing intensity, louder than the sounds of the bustling city around him. For a moment, it was as if the entire world had been silenced, the noise of traffic, the murmur of people, all drowned out by the boy's voice. Matthew's steps faltered, and a deep, gnawing feeling took root in his gut. Was this real? Was the boy's desperate plea just a cry for attention? Or was there something more to this? Something about the way the boy looked at him, so utterly lost and desperate, pulled at something deep inside Matthew, something buried under years of hardened exterior. Against all logic, against every instinct that had kept him focused on wealth, success, and power, Matthew turned back once more. In that fleeting moment, everything changed. His heart pounded, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts, and he felt, for the first time in a long while, the weight of something greater than himself. Matthew's steps quickened as he walked away, but his mind was far from his destination. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat an echo of the boy's desperate cry. The weight of the moment hung heavily on him, and as he moved through the busy streets, his thoughts began to swirl, each one battling against the other. He had spent his entire life making decisions with certainty, driven by logic, power, and numbers. He had built an empire on facts and control, living in a world where everything had its place. But this was different. There were no numbers to calculate, no meetings to dictate his actions. He couldn't apply any of the rules that had served him so well in the past. He couldn't make sense of it. He entered the cafe, the door closing behind him with a soft click. But instead of the usual rush of focus that came with preparing for his next deal, his mind wandered. The boy's words, "My mom is inside," kept repeating in his head. They echoed over and over, relentless and haunting. He tried to push them away, to focus on the coffee sitting in front of him, but it was impossible. The words refused to leave. And then, unexpectedly, a memory surfaced. It wasn't from his recent past, nor from the boardrooms where he spent most of his time. It was from his childhood, a time he had long tried to forget. He remembered himself as a young boy, standing alone in a crowd, unheard, unseen. He remembered the feeling of being invisible in a world that was too busy to notice him. No one had stopped to ask if he was okay. No one had cared. The boy's desperation, his raw pleading, sent a jolt of recognition through Matthew. It reminded him of that same loneliness he had buried deep inside, that same sense of being ignored, pushed aside, left to struggle in silence. It was a feeling he had long since hardened himself against, but now it was as if it had come rushing back. The cafe around him seemed to fade, the noise of the world growing distant as he relived that painful memory. He looked down at his untouched cup of coffee, the cold ceramic offering no comfort. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something crucial he had left behind in his pursuit of power and wealth. The boy's words, the way they tugged at his heart, made him realize that, for all his success, he had forgotten something fundamental. Matthew's chest tightened, and for the first time in years, the walls he had built around himself began to crack. He had spent his life chasing things that didn't matter, running from feelings he didn't want to confront. But that night, something inside him shifted. The boy had reminded him of what it was like to need someone, to cry out for help and be ignored. And Matthew realized that if he didn't do something now, he would be no different from the rest of the world that had walked past the boy. He couldn't let it go, not this time. He stood up from the table, his mind no longer clouded by the distractions of business. He had made a decision. There was no more room for indifference. It was time to act. Time to stop running from what mattered. Matthew left the cafe, his resolve growing stronger with each step. The world could wait. This was bigger than anything he had ever dealt with. In the weeks that followed, Rachel and Evan found a new home in Matthew's mansion. The once cold, sterile halls, filled only with the echo of footsteps, were now alive with the sounds of laughter, of love, and the gentle hum of family. The empty rooms, once symbols of wealth and isolation, had transformed into spaces that resonated with warmth and connection. Matthew's wealth had granted him every material possession he could ever desire, yet it had never filled the deeper emptiness inside him. Despite all his success, he had never known the meaning that came from sharing his life with others, from experiencing true human connection. But now, He had something far more valuable than any sum of money: compassion, understanding, and the satisfaction of knowing he had made a real difference. As Evan ran through the halls, his laughter filling the air, Matthew watched him with a sense of awe. The boy, once lost and alone, was now a part of his life, a symbol of everything he had never known he needed. Matthew realized that this, right here, was the true measure of strength. It wasn't in his wealth or power, which he had spent so many years chasing. It was in the courage to act when no one else would, to stand up when the world chose to look away. The strength lay in believing, even when the situation seemed hopeless. One spring morning, Evan ran into Matthew's study, a wide grin on his face, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to Matthew, proud of his work. It was a drawing, a simple sketch, yet it held more meaning than anything Matthew had ever seen. In the drawing, there were 3 figures: a tall man, a smiling woman, and a little boy holding both their hands. Above them, in uneven letters, Evan had written, "My family." Matthew's heart swelled as he looked at the drawing, a sense of warmth filling him. He had spent so many years thinking that success meant power and wealth. But now, he understood. It wasn't about the contracts he had signed or the fortunes he had amassed. It was about the connections he had made, the love he had given and received, and the boy who had reminded him of what truly mattered. In that moment, Matthew realized that Evan had not only saved his mother, but had also saved him. The boy's refusal to give up had shown him the meaning of life, something far more valuable than any material possession. In the end, it was the love and strength of a family that had redeemed him.